So, as far as I remember, I already give you an introduction on the health economics of arts, which is which enters in the framework of failures on the demand side, given that what we observe is a kind of irrational consumer behavior that, in most cases, knowing that some baths are actually such baths indeed for their health, they continue to consume them. And what is the issue for health economics? The issues of interest for us is not only that the consumption of baths by part of consumers is dangerous for the consumer's health, but also that it might create a problem for the collectivity, which is why a number of governments intervene in the system in order to orient, in a way, the consumer choice. Which are those goods that we consider? Please consider the fact that you might choose one of those paths in order to make your essay. And what I'm expecting in that case is not only the essay, according to the standard of 5,000 words and what else, presentation in the class, but also you have to consider those points related to those goods, which are of interest in terms of public health. So we only refer to, there are a number of parts, but those of interest for health economics are those related to tobacco consumption. In this respect, we have two different issues. One is related to consumption of tobacco by part of children, or in any case, guys below 15 years of age. And in a different way, it can be afforded the problem of adult consumption of tobacco. Why this is so important? But tobacco is a risk factor for a number of disease, and it is considered a sort of emergency around the world, because just from the last report of the OECD, it accounts about 700,000 deaths per year. So it's quite high, much higher of a number of diseases that are widespread all over in the various countries and all over the world, I would say. The second issue, which is also important to be considered, is that related to alcohol consumption. In this case, the number of deaths are about 200, no, that goes about from 255,000 to 290,000 deaths per year across all the European countries. So it's also enormous. And for instance, if we just look at the European countries, we have some problem in handling with alcohol, because it is spread differently among different countries. There have been policies which were quite effective, but the habits are quite often dependent of the the latitude. Northern countries are more used to high consumption of alcohol, but as for the policy, health policy to be applied for alcohol, there are also in Europe and the European countries, there is also the problem of competing policies for countries producing such goods. For instance, think of the wine and the policy made part of the European Union by Italy and France, where there is a sort of protectionism or favorites in treating the production of wine, which might not be a problem according to a number of people, or it is, or it might be a very serious problem in for a number of countries. Also considering that, in particular with respect to the consumption of alcohol, the share of adolescents and children is actually increasing all over the world in a quite unexpected way. Unexpected because even when we use the standard policies for it, which might be inducing an excise tax that increases the price, and so it makes alcohol less attractive for young people simply because their budget is low, is generally low. Well, there are different ways to induce consumption of alcohol. You have to know that quite a recent way for inducing young people to consume alcohol with a little shot, what we call in Italian a shottino. Have you heard about it? Possibly. And this is not so expensive, but it has a quite high level of alcohol, pure alcohol inside, because in general it's not wine, no beer. It's something very alcoholic. And they can consume the little shot of alcohol, paying just €1. And these, in particular for adolescents, induce a kind of habit that is quite dangerous, given that they might become addicted, not only. Apparently, at least there are some studies said that for those drinking, consuming alcohol at a certain age, very young, they don't have the protection that an adult can have. And they might become addicted and with cases or diseases very serious that cannot be solved even if they stop drinking. So this is quite a serious problem that is quite difficult to be solved. Another point that is considered very serious by the OECD organization is that the use of not only junk food, the unhealthy habits of food, toward food. And this is quite another story which is quite difficult to afford, because we can think of as problem, but as very difficult to afford. First, because the data that we have, I will show something, are not so good, because in most cases they are based on self-declaration by part of those which are subject to a survey. So we have only survey data for different countries, and you know that whoever answered the question in an anonymous way it might do it correctly or not. So we are not so sure. But what emerges by looking mainly at developed countries is that first, problems related to obesity, overweight in general, are becoming very serious, and mainly in developed countries, United States and continental Europe are quite bad with number. And the second point, which is quite important, is that the problem of unhealthy habits is typical of less affluent households. It means that it's not related to the level of income, and possibly is related to level of low income, which means that it's something like is something that must be solved with peculiar instrument that get the target. Now, there is another one that I mentioned, which is gaming. Gaming is becoming a problem in most countries. And so if you think of doing your essays, just looking at gaming and the problem of addiction with it, which might generate some problem, because it has been shown that there are addiction problems even for gaming, often with computer gaming. It seems to give social problem, which the OECD does not consider so relevant, at least as those related to tobacco, alcohol, and junk food. I was going to forget another one, and about which we have very bad data, and it is related to the use of illicit drugs, where in this case, actually the number are absolutely, I would say, unrealistic, because we are talking of something that cannot be controlled, because given that the considered good, cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy, and the like, are most of the country observed, are not sold in the market, in the standard market, so you cannot control the sale. So I can't see that the number related to alcohol are not very good, because are based on assumption. But at the same time, I know the level of alcohol, pure alcohol consumed in each country is, because I know the sales, and in general, quite often is, in most countries, is sold in the standard market, in the legal circuit of the market. And in other case, we don't have a market that is controlled. So what we know is simply what people declare in the survey, or there are indirect way to assess the level of consumption of, I don't know, cocaine, cannabis, and the like. For instance, for cocaine, in some countries, the way to determine the consumption is just looking at the water refuse or the level of cocaine in the river, if there are river. And for instance, it happens that in Italy, one of the worst was, well, some years ago was Milan, but then the water of the river Arno was one of the most higher, containing the most, one of the highest level of cocaine. And the same occurred for Thames in London. And if you will see the distribution and the cart, look at it. You will see that among those countries consuming, for instance, cocaine, United Kingdom is at the top. It's one of the worst countries in this respect. But, well, look at some picture that the OECD provides, both related to a number of countries that have answered the question, or the European Union. This is the same of last year, because the surveys in general are every 2 or 3 years. So the report related to health, which considers also these issues, is either 2 or 3 years. So I'm referring to data which were in last year report of the OECD. And the first thing I want to show you is the figures related to tobacco smoking, among tobacco smoking and cannabis uses among children watching more or less 15 years old adolescents. And as you can see that there are various, sorry, harmful topic, so you cannot stand it. Nobody said that. And I also think I didn't show it with those opponents. And it doesn't. You cannot see the screen at all. Why? Can you see the picture now?
Yes, I'll superrepresent.
Good. The first I was saying is related to tobacco smoking and cannabis smoking among adolescents. And as you can see, for instance, in the first case, that is picture here, what it happens with respect to 4 years before, this data have been collected in 2018 and published in 2010-20, is more or less a situation in which the policy done by various governments worked in a way because there is a reduction, which is quite evident with some exception. For instance, Italy doesn't work, but in most cases there is a reduction. The white dot is related to 2014 and the blue one is related to 18. So as you can see, a number of countries, but by the way, Italy, Latvia, Hungary, there is no effect. In the other cases, there is a quite strong effect. The same situation does not occur, but I mentioned the fact that the data can be a bit not correct, is for the use of cannabis among adolescents. And in this situation of cannabis or illicit drugs, the point about how to solve the problem as a problem of the health system is whether to use a strong ban of this kind of consumption, which is quite difficult to realize in different countries, or else, as in some cases it happens, like Canada, like some states of the United States, is legalize the consumption of cannabis so that the consumption is in a way regulated by the health system, at least for the quality that is sold. And in a way, the price can go under the control of the government. And a second good point for it is making it legal. It reduces the need to try to find these goods by a criminal organization, which are a further problem that can occur when people want to consume cannabis and they cannot find in the standard market. The consumption of cigarettes is quite important also for odors. Because why it is an health problem that must be considered. It is not true the fact that if I smoke, the danger is only mine, but it might be even for others. And it is well known, and there is a sentence of the Court of Justice in the United States that condemns not only the people smoking, but also those producing tobacco for the damage given to those who were passive smokers. And so, in a way, there is an external effect of cigarette, of tobacco use, even for those that does not consume tobacco. This is quite important because there is, it is considered the major risk factor and for causes of mortality due to cancer and circulatory disease. It gives a chronic respiratory disease, and in most cases, it reduces the expected life of about 3 years for smokers. So it is taken in serious consideration, mainly because, not only because the government wants to be altruistic, because the cure, even it are very expensive in all these cases. So the fact that person having bad habits influences the system in a way that it is expensive for all the collectivity might be considered dangerous. Because if I get cancer, I'm an avid smoker. If I get cancer, at a certain point I must be cured. And this is my right, at least in this country. And the government have to provide the cure for it. So it's a social problem and it is quite expensive. Notice that in this case, in general, there is the OECD points to the fact that, well, there are different habits between men and women, the gender problem, and it is quite interesting that the gender gap is reduced in those countries which are considered more, in a way, more evolved for the problem of gender, because, for instance, all the Scandinavian countries have reduced the gender gap so that women and men smoke more or less at the same manner. Even Iceland entered into those countries that doesn't have any gender gap. You can see it in this picture here, figure 4.4, where you can see that, for instance, Sweden, Finland, even Luxembourg, but I look also in the part in which the country are not in the European Union, where Iceland and Norway are those in which the gap is absolutely reduced. I would swear that is a good point for reduction of discriminatory disease behavior between men and women, but I don't know. Now, look at the other picture that is quite interesting, and it is related to the alcohol consumption of adolescents. I think that the last picture, no, it's not the last. I want to show also what we know about the use of illicit drugs. And as you can see, the first figure, 4.9, which is related to the cannabis, put the continental Europe among the highest consumer of cannabis. Whereas if we look at cocaine, the special features were at the top. We have UK, Ireland, France, and Spain. With related, the last picture, no, really the last is related to the consumption of healthy food. Now, in this case, it's quite difficult, even in this case, it is quite difficult to measure, from an health economics point of view, to measure which is the the right thing to do. Why? Because the index that says that, for instance, obesity or overweight is a problem in a community is what is called body mass index. And body mass index above a certain number, which it should be, well, I look at it. I've written it somewhere, but I will find it. It's quite difficult to be considered because it should be calculated for each individual and is in a way out of control from the authorities. So what we can do if we want to act some policies that reduce the consumption of those goods, we are considered unhealthy for nutrition. Simply try to focus on those food which includes, for instance, a high level of fat, a high level of sugar, of what else? Alcohol as something that must be considered, and but the way to consider it is quite difficult to be combated. Now, for instance, this is a quite interesting point to be considered now, that we will see in a few minutes, because which are the kind of policy that government can use for public health in order to solve this problem. Can you think of something? Well, I mentioned excise taxation, we will see how it works. But what else? We have two main instruments of government. If you know that your country has a huge problem of tobacco, use of unhealthy food, cannabis, or the like, what can you do? You are the government and you want to solve this problem, which is very expensive to be managed.
To ban advertisements for such products, for tobacco products.
So is that again?
To ban advertisements for tobacco products.
For instance, this is a good, there are actually two practices. One is that of using taxation, because if you offer of a price, you make it more difficult to buy the good that is unhealthy. So increase the price by using taxation. You tax all those people consuming cigarettes. And for instance, decide that an excise tax of, say, 100 euros is for any package of cigarettes that is sold. And it might become quite difficult for young people to buy a package of cigarettes that costs more than 100 euros. It might drastically reduce the consumption of tobacco. At a certain point, we will see this point later. The second one is using advertising or banning, completely banning, because there are two alternatives. You can use advertisement in order to say that it is unhealthy. And so you consider paying a campaign of advertisement, say that the consumption of something doesn't work, that's not good. Or you can ban advertisement when for all those goods that are considered unhealthy. Now, and these three cases, how it works, this is a second step that you are required to consider if you want to make the essay in one of these things. But we will see later on with a focus on the specific taxation that we can use and the effect of taxation, of excise taxation on it. But as for advertising, what would you expect if you use a campaign against tobacco, for instance. So you, in Italy, some years, I don't remember exactly the year, but there was the ban for advertisement for cigarettes from all the media. So it was not possible to make advertisement in any form, direct or subliminal, as it is called, of cigarettes. So what would you expect from this kind of campaign? Then there is the ban, which is something, the ban not of advertisement, the ban of the consumption of the good. But you ban first advertisement on cigarettes. What are you expecting to happen? Any idea? Is that a good policy or effective policy? Italy has banned advertising. Some other countries, for instance, Canada, some years ago, not too far away, decided not only to ban the advertisement, but also ban the shop selling tobaccos to show in the window or even in the bar the cigarettes. So who enters and a specific shop cannot see cigarettes shown, just here and there. Normally, I'm a heavy consumer of cigarettes. So when you enter, you can see at the back of the person selling the cigarettes all the different types of cigarettes. Well, this is banned in Canada, I think also in the United States, but they cannot show cigarettes even in the shop that sells cigarettes. What is the expected effect? And what would you expect from this kind of policy? Will it work? No idea, even at home. Well, for cigarettes, at least in those countries in which there's been the ban of advertisement of cigarettes, given that cigarettes cannot be advertised, at the same time of the ban of cigarettes, also stopped the campaign in favor of non-smokers. And the fact was that at the end of the campaign, the percent of people smoking, mainly young people, increased as a result of the stop of the campaign that were related to cigarettes. So in most cases, what happens is that government started thinking that, well, I'm not giving any advertisement for cigarettes, so I don't need also to make the people sensitive of the problem of smoking. And so at the same time, the ban of advertisement was associated with the stop of health information about the danger of use of tobacco. And at the end of the day, what happens is that in some countries, the number of people smoking was increased after the ban. And more or less the same occurred when there was the ban of cigarettes with strong policy, for instance, in the United States, from all the public places. It was more or less respected, but it was a kind of campaign that lasted for a certain period. And geographically moving, it began so this is Ovest, part of California was very strong at first, and then it moved even to east. I mean, East Coast, Washington, New York, but Illinois is also quite strong. And at least at the beginning, everybody was so excited that apparently all the person that tried to smoke in situation which was ambiguous were treated in quite aggressive way in those cases in which smoking was allowed. But then people relapsed, and with the same quickness in which they were so happy of contributing to the campaign against smoke, they start to be relaxed, and well, after a few years, the attitude of people, first in California and the west states of the United States, they relapsed, and then even in the east part of the United States, where even in those cases in which the policies were associated to smoking. For instance, it's quite recent, I think this was 2 years ago, there was the ban of smoking even in the public park, in all open zone in the New York City. But apparently it didn't work very well. Now, how is the problem of the merit good or bad afforded in health economics? But I put all these features related to the number of the figures, related to the figures in ICT countries, from which you can have an idea of the importance of the problem and also the country which can be object of studies. Anyway, going back to the theory, what the theory says, how these habits of consumers are afforded in the theory. As for, there are two fields that can be of interest. One is related to the consumption habits, and in particular to all those situations in which that try to explain why a rational individual is taking decisions which are not completely rational. So the point in that part of theory is that of giving explanation about why people, in most cases, knowing that their consumption is something bad for the earth, he continues to have these consumption habits. And the model of addiction can be of various types because they try to explain even why inside the standard model of perfect competition you can find people that are not so rational. And there are models that explain that why people are not rational or not fully rational. Or, for instance, other models that try to explain why people have this kind of behavior, simply looking at their so-named myopic behavior toward consumption dynamically. So there is a theory that considers that the individual, and it is certainly true, more or less, are in a way myopic with respect to most cases, even those strictly related to their own health effect due to the consumption of some goods. It means that this is considered a variant of the so-called imperfectly rational model. So the first case is that in which individuals are imperfectly rational. The second part, the second model, consider individual in a way myopic, so they cannot see too far, but just look at a short time decision, and then the standard answer is, well, I will stop at 85 about that suits quite well to my attitude to cigarettes. I'm sure I will stop give up smoking quite soon, but in the short time, there is a kind of I shift my decision in a quite long-term future. There is another interesting model of addiction that is related to the so-called rational addiction. This is quite interesting because possibly in the past, one of the theory was that of considering those people addicted to some substance or whatever it is, because of their being unaware of the consequences of becoming addicted or the consequence of consuming this substance. For instance, when I started smoking very early. I was about 15, I think, more or less. I didn't know at all the consequences of smoking, but could you now say that individuals that even start smoking so early don't know the effect of cigarettes or are fully unaware of the effect of cigarettes or unaware of the effect of alcohol, even if they are so young, was the most important problem in the developed country seems to show. So apparently no, as now more or less very young, beginning from very young people, most of them are, I wouldn't say fully, but in a way aware that smoking is bad, that consuming alcohol is bad. But even in that case, they continue to smoke or start smoking, not fully aware that it might become an addicted or that even worse, beginning so early in age, it might increase the bad consequence, the bad consequence when they become adults, because the problem are accumulated over time. And anyway, even though this kind of theory are quite fascinating because they try to explain in a way irrational behavior of consumption of individuals. This is not the point of view that interests us because what we want to see is not exactly other as economists. It's not exactly to discover why individuals are taking a kind of decision rather than another, but mainly we want to see whether there are ways for intervene in order to avoid the worst consequences of this kind of consumption. And in this respect, the second group of theories that we are to consider are those that in a way explain the rationale for government intervention. And in particular, the two main way for government intervention, which are related to the use of excise taxes on the consumption of goods and their role of advertising. Sometimes they come the two instruments and the model that are considering them can be used jointly with some problem that should be considered. And this is why I will make a focus on the use of taxation because it's quite interesting. And I said they can be considered jointly, and but we have to be quite careful of the effect of each of them and the ways that we might be called to consider when you will become an economist and suggesting policies or whatever with the use of this instrument is to consider in the proper way the fact that both these instruments can have mild taxation, which is, I mentioned already last time, it might often be, is often used by government, not exactly as a way to induce the right behavior, whatever it means, right behavior of consumers, but it's a way to make money, a part of government. And moreover, we have to be very careful when using taxation, excise taxation, because the effect in some cases might be reversed. For instance, when I was a student, I studied in England. And when I was a student, exactly in that year, I'm thinking of the last century, it's not very old. The British government started a strong policies aimed at reducing the consumption of cigarettes among students. And the best way was that of introducing a quite heavy excise tax on cigarettes of any type. What was the result? What would you expect? Are you smoking? Nobody. So you're very healthy at the moment. Do you smoke? No. How many at home are smoking? How many? Nobody. No, tell me. I'm the only smoker in this house.
No, fortunately.
Is there anybody smoking in this class? I'm embarrassed. You cannot understand what I'm talking about without experience. You. At last, bye. And the class there is only one declaring to smoke. I don't know if it is true. How many at home? Nobody. Well, you don't know what you miss, but anyway, it's good for you. And which is the degree of intolerance against smokers?
What?
Intolerance, personal intolerance against people smoking around you. So you see, it might be your right to give that you are a passive smoker in some cases, no? So what is your degree of tolerance of habits? You like people smoking around you?
For me, it doesn't matter. I don't have any preference.
Which country are you?
I'm from Bosnia.
Sorry?
I'm from Bosnia.
Say it again.
Bosnia and Herzegovina. Next to Croatia.
Bulgaria, you said.
What?
Which country are you?
I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Ah, Bosnia,
Yeah.
Bosnia. Oh, yeah. I'm also deaf, a smoker, deaf, the worst. So you don't mind.
No. I mean, I used to smoke when I was younger, but I quit.
Good.
So maybe because of that, but I really don't mind the clubs and everyone's smoking.
What about the other?
If the room is really small, I can bear, but totally bearable for me.
Actually, you should be angry against.
What?
You should be angry against those smoking around you. You are
I
not.
should be against. I couldn't understand, sorry.
You should be angry against those smoking around you. Disappointed. No.
No,
Not
not
even.
like that, but if I feel like I can rest, yes, I could say something.
So the only heroes in this class, how many cigarettes? You. How many cigarettes a day?
5.
you're not smoking.
So what would happen, what would be your behavior if the government decide to increase with the price of cigarettes? Will you stop, reduce?
Probably reduce, but not to stop.
Not to stop. In fact, what happened, at least in the UK, was that, the market for cigarettes is a very complicated one, because you can't distinguish, and this is something important to be considered, because from the point of view of the public health, the consumption of cigarettes, of any kind of tobacco, is dangerous, is considered such. Much more for the fact that you smoke burning something and introduce something that's burned in your body. And this is what is dangerous. Doesn't matter what it is, if it's tobacco high quality or low quality, it doesn't matter. And as you possibly know, even if you don't smoke, there are very different kinds of cigarettes. Are those of high quality, low quality, those to be rolled, those whatever. So what happens in general when the excise tax is introduced? Must be, if you want to know the effect of the introduction of taxation in a given market like this, which is quite complicated. First of all, because there is not a pure competitive market, in spite of it seems such. There is a kind of imperfect competition, I would call it oligopolistic competition in the market for cigarettes, high quality, which means those produced by, say, Philip Morris and the like. There are 5 brands. That must be considered because they have high price. And the first thing to be considered is the elasticity of, with respect to price of consumption behavior. So what you have to see is how the demand for cigarettes would change by changing the price. And the elasticity varies depending on the quality of the good considered. And what happened in the UK, at last I will tell you, is that young people smoking cigarettes, the blondes, it's called blondes, called heavy rolled, was a switch to those to be rolled because they were less expensive. It was an habit that now is quite common even in Italy, but in the past in Italy it was not so common. And well, possibly your generation has considered them. I'll shout because I'm deaf.
I think there are lots of different kinds of advertising for smoking. For example, we can see in the movies and series that the star, the celebrity, are smoking, and there are kind of role model in every society. So people tend to imitate of them. Yeah, and it's a kind of advertising. And on the other hand, people have other choices to smoke, and totally it's a kind of need for that part of the society that they want to do this entertainment. So I think there is no way to control on these habits, because people like to do this kind of entertainment, other entertainment that other people prefer.
Well, this is partially true, but for instance, if you think that Hollywood banned even that called indirect advertisement of smoking, which consists in a number of movies. You see people that your hero, that is in the movie, smoking. That's
I'm
why I
not a
haven't-
smoker, but when I watch some series, I like to smoke. I think it's a good thing for daily.
No, in fact, but this was banned in the United States. Then they noticed that it didn't work. And the freeway for smoking was introduced again in the movie. The production of Hollywood movies was required to avoid all that situation in the movie itself, in which the protagonist or any person was smoking and could pass as an ears for someone that could imitate. This is called subliminal message or that induce imitation, even without saying directly, well, smoke Marlboro. In the past, it was very used to do this, and the most common way to advertise cigarettes was that of showing in a movie the heroes that smokes or that drink alcohol, and you see the brand of the cigarettes that he smokes, and or the brand of the alcohol that is advertised in this way because it was considered very effective. For a number of years, it was fun this way of advertising. Then it was noticed that it didn't work. Personally, that's the contract.
But what about the other way of smoking, not just cigarettes, other way of smoking?
What about?
Yes,
No, I didn't tell you. Said that.
I said, what about other ways of smoking? Not just cigarettes, there are different kinds of smoke that people tend to do it. Different kinds.
I don't
There-
know what is your question for.
I'm saying that there is no way to quit the smoking or make it lessen. There isn't no way that advertising doesn't work, and I don't know, taxation doesn't work because there are low quality products that people can use.
Well, this is true for almost every kind of bad habits in consumption. You cannot eliminate the problem. I think that would be impossible. But apparently, a kind of advertising which is targeted to a sort of education for healthy habits apparently works, because we have seen before at the beginning the story is how has changed the children habits for alcohol. And what we see that what we have seen is that in those countries having this kind of policy, it did actually work, because in the last 10 years, in most countries, the situation has changed. For instance, in the northern countries, like the Scandinavian one, where there was a quite strong policy against alcohol, and it gave its effect, as well as the policy against tobacco, which was made either by education. I wouldn't call it advertisement. It was a kind of education on the right habits for health, for an healthy life. And on the other side, it was a quite strong policy of taxation. For example, I am very old. So last century, when my English friends went to study in the Scandinavian country, well, in England, there is this habit of drinking beer during the weekend in an amount which is almost impossible for my standard. But for English students, is the standard, and they start drinking at 6 o'clock of Friday. And when I went to Scandinavian countries, beer was so expensive that it was something that almost no students could afford. So it worked in a way, as well as the policy of increasing the price of cigarettes by means of taxation. And in England, in a way, it works. Well, look, when I was there, apparently the newspaper reported that the most stolen tools in the disco was cigarettes. So the story was that if you left your purse or your bag somewhere, you could find back if you go back. If you miss cigarette or leave there somewhere, it disappears. So they were so expensive that it was something considered important, but it cannot be eliminated, but at least it can be reduced. I think this is the main target of the public policy.
No, I mean, even the full taxation,
Even if they,
if by taxation, they increase the price of a cigarette, as a smoker, I would go for a low quality one because I need it.
it happens sometimes. But there is also the second point I was going to tell you when you study, when as health economists, we try to apply a policy against tobacco, is that there is a level sickness of various people. So it is very difficult that those who don't have problem of income problem, no budget restraint, switch, a change level of cigarette, at least for adults. It might happen for adolescents or students because they have no money. And in that case, I mentioned that they start rolling and then switch directly to the less expensive way to smoke, and possibly it's even better. But in most cases, this is quite a strange market. Contains also the fact that being the issue related to addiction, there is a kind of sickness to the level, and with some difficulties, an heavy smoker will change the level of cigarettes that is, even if the price increases. For instance, well, you don't smoke, so there is no problem, but as a smoker, the reason why I stopped smoking Marlboro was that I would have increased. It was not the price. It was that I liked so much Marlboro that the number of cigarettes that I had smoked, in that case, it would be much higher than I smoke something that I don't like. This is my policy, health policy. But it's not a matter of price. Simply, it was a matter of reducing the number, which is very high in my case. And if I know perfectly that I doubled the number of cigarette smokers as switched to Marlboro Red, which are the best, of course.
For example, I want to say, in my country,
You shouldn't speak up because at home I don't think.
in my country, many years ago, it was a kind of stigma.
Where are you
when-
from?
I'm from Iran.
You know,
Yeah, it was a kind of stigma for young people and also for women to smoke. But nowadays, it's not, and people change their mind about smoking. So nowadays, the fact that many women tend to smoke and many young people prefer to smoke. And I think it goes to the culture, it goes back to the cultures and their point of view about smoking also. Not just the duty of a government, it's related to culture as well.
this is very true, absolutely true for alcohol. Because in Muslim country, the problem does not exist, at least it's not declared. In most countries like Turkey, we don't have any figures from Iran, I think. But recent Turkey is It's a country where nobody declares to drink alcohol, but they do. It's quite free. Brazil is one of the worst fast food models, and there is quite high gender tax, which is reducing. I don't know if there any round figures, but and it's very, it is absolutely true that the habits or religious habits in this case can make the difference. But the point is that with some changes in your government becoming more relaxed as for religious issues, like for instance the Khomeini government. So now, at least now people declare that they are doing something that is not considered, is not very well appreciated by their religion. And this is another problem that we might have for it. So, that is the problem. Go back, I just make a short summing up because I want to switch to the last part of the program, and then I leave my last two lectures with the focus on the use of excise taxation for this. But today I would like to end at least the basic things that you have to know. And so when you study the market, so when you want to intervene with measures, government measures, we have to consider all the possible relations. For instance, I'm not basically an health economist, I'm a public finance economist. And for instance, some measures that are not likely to be taken in Europe for nutrition and food. Now there is a quite big issues due to the fact that, for instance, it has been shown that increasing the price of junk food doesn't work at all for reducing the consumption. Why not? Because the variety of junk food is so enormous that it's almost impossible to eat that consumption. And I was saying before that, for instance, all those measures that I have tried, Hungary, United States, Denmark, whatever. These are the countries with the more strong measures, or with excise tax, that try to eat with excise taxation the use of junk food, did not succeed in modifying the habit, because mainly in the market for food, it's very easy to find substitutes or complements that are exactly dangerous and for some reason are not hit by taxation. So in that case, the use of advertisement, but in a different form of advertisement for the consumption of junk food, the use of labeling, for instance, or the traffic light labeling is something that in the United Kingdom was considered very effective. What is that? This is a different form of, this is a form of informative advertising that consists in selling something with declare in a way, already in the label, whether the food, in this case, this is used mainly for food, might be dangerous or not, or is something good or healthy. And apparently the kind of informative advertising was that having the best effect. Part of informative negative advertising in the packet of cigarettes, where you can find the word thing That you can imagine here there is one with another tap, which is like which consists in putting a color in each label of each product, saying that depending on the color, that kind of food is more or less dangerous. And for instance, depending of the level of saturated fat contained in the level of sugar contained in the food, or the level of salt, or whatever you consider dangerous, you can find either this kind of decision, uh, like it should be done in Europe in a too strict way. What happens is the number of products coming from different countries that are considered uh, excellence. For instance, a number of products from Italy, like cheese, olive oil, uh, typical product from some countries, but also the European Union is not a federation of states, but is a union of states with their own sovereignty, which means that the national interest in that case is for protection of their own goods, which would not happen in a kind of federation because there is a sort of heart of all the policy by the federal states. We don't have this situation. So each state competing with the other and for its own product can be like Italy, high quality products that are at certain point penalized, considering that unhealthy for the collective issue, which is exactly now discussed by the European Parliament. And also the European Commission is trying to find an exit from this situation, because how can you penalize so strongly? For different reasons, I know, or even chocolate, which is essentially quite high production of very high quality, or olive oil, which is from one side, on the one side we have a high quality product which should be protected. merit and merit good and the failures on the demand side. And I to the last issues of my part of the lecture that is related to the failure on both the demand and supply side together. And for it, I will leave the last few lectures, which means next week, to see how the excise taxation works and the effects on consumption in the market, because the minor exercise to be done are when we consider all the air policy or in presence of bad goods are those related to the use of taxation, at least, and sometimes advertising, or sometimes the joint policies together, where we cannot give a general view of the effectiveness of the use of these policies, simply because their effectiveness depends on which market they are applied directly, and the result changes very much depending on the market, the country, the availability on the market of the goods that we are going to consider. So any situation must be considered on purpose and with all its own details. But at least for taxes, I will give you the basic in order to see how they effectively work in the market and what makes the difference and which are the effects of introducing taxation. Notice that when we are talking about excise taxation as an instrument of public finance to address the behavior of consumers, what we are doing is something very strange, and it might be very distorted, because anytime that we introduce taxation in the market, it determines effect on the level of equilibrium that individuals have found in the market, which might be disturbed and might be very distorted, and might also have the opposite effect with respect to those expected. So that at least to my students of the course of public economics, undergraduate course, when I show them the effect of taxation, what I know exactly is that any government must be very careful in introducing the form of taxation for orienting in a way the behavior of individuals, because the consequences in the market must be even much worse than those expected. And it's not said at all. You will see also in the chapter of the book that explains the economics of budget, that reports a number of cases in which different instruments were used, that the effects are not so obvious because the individual can adjust almost easily, and in general, the effect is unexpectedly bad for the market itself. Now, we will talk again about taxation as an instrument for acting in this market, not as a measure against consumption of the merit good. But I want to talk about now is the last is the last bit. No, which is not here. No. Is the last part of the market value that considers a different kind of goods that we call the redistributive good. Well, we have seen that different kind of market failure that suggests government to intervene in the market. And we'll see it at first. And in all those cases, either on the market failure on the supply side or market failure on the demand side, you have seen that there is a quite big room for health economics, because in most cases, even though the good considered which government should intervene in some form, either with regulation or with provision or with direct production or with taxation, are not Samsonian public goods. Health goods and services have a wide space, which is due to the fact that the health goods and services are kind of hybrid goods that have some feature which support the fact that individual facing the consumption of such goods should be in a way and ask for the support of the government. And the same may occur for the third kind of market failure, which are those related to supply and demand market failure that occur simultaneously. Which kind of situation I'm talking about? We are in that situation in which how can we see that there is a market failure that affects both demand and supply at the same time? The situation is that in which we observe in the market, for instance, the case in which a very small percentage of people in a given country is absolutely rich, and it takes more than, say, 70% of the income produced by that country. So it means that in Italy it's not so different. In Italy, almost the 5% has more than 80% of the income produced in the country, and the rest is sharing a very low amount of income. So we are in those situations in which there are extremely rich people, few of them with respect to the rest of the population, and an increasing number, well, big number, actually I would say increasing in the last years of crisis, of people that are becoming poor and poor. And this situation is considered market failure because whatever you look at it, if you see that there is someone who is extremely rich and someone else, and the majority of the country which is extremely poor, possibly it means that the market hasn't worked. And for this reason, something should be done. So to have the signal for us is enough that to see how the income redistribution of the country. And if you see, for instance, that, I don't know if you have heard about it, but the Lawrence Court is very close to the axis. It means that the distribution of income in a given country is very bad. How should the government intervene in this case? The intervention is that which calls for the use of so-called redistributive goods, or the action, the policy is redistribution. And that if there are an enormous amount of people below the poverty threshold, possibly a given society is expected to intervene in order not to make those people die. because people below the poverty level are in a very bad situation. What to do in that case? What would you do if we are in a situation in which there are people on a quite big number of individuals in your country that are below the poverty threshold? And so they have problems to eat, for instance, to be cured if they are ill. Any idea? I think it's more or less a problem of all the countries represented in this class. Italy is becoming it's going very bad as for the figures related to it. And last year, after the Lehman Brothers crisis, the number of people living below the poverty threshold is increased in an unexpected way, almost doubled. And now, after the COVID and then after the war, it is expected to increase. What about your countries? Who is not Italian yet? What about Iran?
The persons?
Can you see this problem in Iran?
Yes, of course.
What about your country? You are from Turkey. You're from where?
From Uganda.
Uganda. What about Uganda?
Yes, yeah, it's good.
What about Bosnia?
Of course, yeah.
And what would you do? So we have a number of sites here. You are from?
Italy.
Italy. We know about Italy. You?
Iran.
Iran.
Turkey.
Turkey. So what would you do? So then I would like also to ask to those at home, what would you do if you discovered that in your country now you are looking closing the everything. If you discover that in your country there are a number of people below the poverty threshold, which kind of intervention would you do?
Stop taxation again.
Sorry?
By taxation.
But if you tax the poor people, I don't know, it cannot pay. If there are poor people and you tax them,
No, by taxation on some industry.
you tax the other and then dispute income. And how would you redistribute? Because the problem here is not that of having a mechanism of redistribution from rich to poor, from affluent to less affluent, but is to make this policy measure effective. So what would you do?
At first, the government have to do something with their infrastructure. And for example, being in a poor condition is because of the job. People mostly can't find the job with a decent salary. That's why they are on their threshold. And the first thing is finding a bed.
Bed
Yeah.
to live.
The infrastructure, I mean, to access to a decent salary. I think there.
And did it work? Did it work in Iran? Because the point in this situation in general is very serious because well, this might be a good way to intervene. But what I'm thinking of is a situation in which at the end of the month, people don't have the food. After a few days, the money are finished. So you can build all the infrastructure that you want, but if you don't give something to eat to the poor family or less affluent families go like this, they die. So anyway, this is a policy which seems quite slow, but that might be a policy. Like create infrastructure in order to find them a job. And you find that it works in Iran.
Of course, many people suffer from don't having any job to do, especially in the cities that are far from the capital. And it's the main problem in Iran. And also, we have the other condition that may you know, they are under sanction. This is also the other problem that people are in that condition.
What about Uganda? Did the government do anything against poverty in Uganda?
Yeah, but it doesn't seem to work because general challenges like corruption. So there's two people, poor people over time.
How many in number?
The poverty line is
Does the government do anything in order to help people that are below the poverty?
yeah, the government is really trying to do something like investing, giving them money to businesses to start up something small and trying to reach for them in international markets. Let's say the poor people who are doing agriculture, the government is buying their coffee and selling it, let's say legally and something like this. But still, this doesn't seem to solve their problems, to get them out of the poverty.
What about Boston?
Well, I think that, first of all, our industry is really bad for
But this is a problem.
yeah, there's not much industry to do. So we don't have that type of money that's coming in the country. We are very dependent on the other bigger countries that invest in us. And lately, because of the
The
recession,
unemployment level, which you know the figures of the unemployment level.
I didn't get it.
The unemployment rate in your country is
Yeah.
high, low,
It's very high. Yeah.
very high.
I don't know exact percentage, but it's very high. I mean,
And the level of poverty is high or low? Low.
it's not very high. We are not very poor country, but still it's one of the poorest, for
And
example.
it doesn't
Europe.
mean, be careful, because the point doesn't mean that the country is poor.
Okay.
The poverty level is like Russia. Russia has a very reduced number of very incredibly rich people and the majority of people below the threshold, which are increasing in the last years of the medium class, which was better than before. But this is a quite, and doesn't mean that it's poor, and it's not dependent on the economic sanction that is having now. It just means it's the problem and the failure of the economy is due to the distribution of income amongst individuals, which means if you can observe that in a rich country, mainly in a rich country, those people having the wealth are only few, it means that something hasn't worked. This is the problem of failure. So you might have the problem in Bosnia, even if Bosnia, I don't know, as an hypothetical reasoning, is very rich. Because if you are, there is petrol or whatever, and only one person can use it, overall the country might be rich, but all the others is not affected by this. This is the point that makes the government, the market failure. Unequally distribution of income. Which, well, in the market you would never find, with difficulty you could find unequal distribution of income, but in general, there must be something that is acceptable. But if you can see this leverage, in the society, in the distribution of income, well, it means that something hasn't worked. Nothing to do with the richness of the country. Any other cases? I missed any country? That one now is from where? You. Hidden by the people. Which country? Rwanda. And what about Rwanda? And now it's becoming rich because Boris Johnson is sending there all the immigrants. Have you heard about it? Boris Johnson is making a deal with the Rwanda government and he wants to send all the illegal immigration going to UK are going to be sent to Rwanda. At least. Did you know about it? Please speak up because I don't listen, I don't think they do.
Also in Rwanda, there are many people who are so the government tries to finance them and they invest in the mass and try to not try them like
But the government is giving money to the people,
yeah,
directly money.
they try to cut them access to services.
So please speak up.
We help them the ability to access for services for free or for less compared to the other.
And this. Ciao.
Yeah, she said that they are trying to.
Bravo, senti che voce. Vai.
Yeah, they are trying to reduce taxes for people starting businesses,
Ah,
something like this, yeah.
and it
Poor
works
starting businesses.
for poor.
Yeah.
The number of poor is reduced by this measure. Good. What else, any other countries? Well, we'll see what happens and what the theory says about it. Because this part, we'll see it next week. This part is that part linking to the second part, which introduced the fiscal federalism, which is one way for managing public health system. Well, not very well in Italy because we use a kind of regional way for the management of the health system, but it might be a way for make the system working well. We'll see next Thursday. Good. I will begin also with taxation. Any question in regard to?
No. No, thank you. No, thank you, Professor.
What?